All right.
Hi, Mackenzie.
We're live. Hi,
We're
Chapella.
live.
Hello, HFC Boot Camp.
Hello. So good to be here.
Super excited to have Ignacio Chapella here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're going to be talking about pesticides and environmental degradation.
Sure.
And giving you guys the tools to be able to speak to anyone confidently about how pesticides impacts the environment and connects to climate change. Yeah. So what comes to mind for you, when you're thinking about pesticides and environmental degradation?
Yeah, it's very, very important. I'm so glad that you guys are doing this. It's so essential because we don't address it, even though it's deeply in our environment and the environment as it comes into our bodies. Our bodies have become loaded with pesticides because we apply them because they're convenient. Then we forget about them because we don't see them, but they come back into our bodies and into our waterways and of course everywhere. So this is really, really important. And what comes to mind first is to separate, really distinguish between the direct effects of pesticides, herbicides, for example, or insecticides, fungicides, the direct effects on me, my children, the waterways, the soils, the food that we eat. Those are direct effects that are really, really bad. If you get exposed, even if you don't feel it at the beginning, and an exposure that takes time, over time, if you repeat that exposure, can really have very deep effects on your physiology. The physiology, for example, if you're going to have a baby, the physiology of that baby and into future generations. It's something that is super important. The other thing that comes to mind is the indirect effects of pesticides, because pesticides are an integral part. The only reason why we have them is because we have made this decision to grow our food and to deal with our environment with this specific way of dealing with it. Yeah. And that way was inaugurated really in the 1930s, 40s, and then put into broad use in the 60s and 70s. So it's something really recent.
Yeah.
It's something as old as I am, more or less. It's not like we have always lived with this. No, it's not like we have always needed it. No, it's a new development. And it's only now that we begin to recognize all the incredible effects, especially the indirect effects that this pesticide use has.
Yeah, and it's funny, or it's interesting when you try to convince decision makers not to use it. They say, oh, this is the way it's always been, as if we've always been doing this, and we really haven't. But I don't think a lot of people know or realize that it's such a recent history.
Yeah, it is a history that really starts off with the end of the Second World War. Pesticides are chemicals that derive from the chemistry of war. Fertilizers come directly from the chemistry of production of explosives. Yeah. And when the Second World War ends, the very same factories that were producing explosives immediately shifted around to produce fertilizers. And that's where it's basically finding something that needs to be used in something and discovering that it can be applied in the environment. And you can have all these incredible consequences that are very good immediately, but then over the long term, they're incredibly bad. And that is the problem, that anyone who says, well, this is the way we've always done it, is really outdated. Is someone who doesn't really understand that the times today are very different from the 1950s and 1960s.
Yeah, and Bridget is doing a whole history of pesticides lesson with them, so they'll get the whole World War, invention of these herbicides. So they'll get a full...
That's very important because, what that brought about is the petrolization of agriculture and environmental everything. The use of petroleum, coal too, the fossilization, we could call it, of environmental applications, where we just decide we're going to burn off all the coal that we have and all the petroleum that we have. Who cares about future generations? Because it was convenient. It allowed us, my generation and the generation before me, it allowed us to do things faster, bigger, and especially with fewer people. The whole mechanization of the landscape, of the environment, of the agricultural field that removed people from the landscape, made it possible to have this, what's called the green revolution.
Yeah, and that is really important what he's saying about pesticides and fertilizers being petroleum based, because there's so much attention on divesting your institution away from fossil fuels, and it's also important to focus on the fact that if you're talking about divesting from fossil fuels, we should also be focusing on fossil fuel based chemicals that are being used on the campus ground. So if your school has a big statement about fossil fuel just divestment, you could say, hey, and we should also be stopping the use of these petroleum based pesticides.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Because in every pound of pesticide, in every pound of fertilizer, comes a huge amount behind it. There's a huge amount of petroleum or coal that has been used to make that chemical possible and distribute it, send it over. The other big thing is mechanization. So the Green Revolution is based on dwarf varieties of plants, not what we're talking about, heavy use of pesticides, heavy use of fertilizers, mechanization, heavy use of machinery, and water, huge amounts of water. All these 5 elements are what made the Green Revolution, and of these, pesticides are really central and probably the most damaging because they remained in the environment. And now it's really the new generations that are facing the problems of the past.
Yeah. And when you talk about these indirect effects, can you give a few examples of either animals or just different parts of ecology that are impacted by pesticides in the long term?
Yes, so these I think I would consider still direct effects because it is the direct chemical that is affecting the physiology of, let's say, a plant, which was the purpose of a herbicide, right? The purpose of herbicides is to kill plants. The purpose of insecticides is to kill insects. The purpose of fungicides is to kill fungi. Now, people compare that to bactericides, antibiotics. It's not the same thing. The difference is that bacteria are so different from us that it is not hard to come up with a chemical approach that will kill the bacterium but will not kill me or not affect me so badly, even though it's not good to use too many antibiotics. But bacteria are very different. The problem with the other pesticides is that the organisms that are supposed to be killed by them are too close to us. Insects are animals. Fungi, they look very different, but they're actually quite close if you think about them in physiological terms. So you cannot come up with a fungicide or an insecticide that will kill a fungus, that will kill an insect without affecting animals like ourselves, other animals like ourselves, but of course all the other animals that are everywhere. With herbicides, it actually happens the same. Plants are a little bit more distant, but they're still too close for comfort in terms of the kinds of things that you can do to them without hurting ourselves or the other organisms that we love.
I remember learning about the way glyphosate was designed to kill a plant. It affects your gut in the same way, that it's designed to affect the shikimate pathway and all these things and kill your gut. And that's why, who knows, but a lot of people are experiencing gut health issues. And
they really didn't think about, when they were proposing a glyphosate as a herbicide, they didn't think about hormonal effects. So that shikimate pathway really links very directly to hormonal behavior. And so things like atrazine 2 have effects on our hormonal system, our hormones that were not predictable when they were put out. The people producing them didn't really want to find bad consequences, so they didn't look too hard. And I work for that industry, so I know more or less how far we want to look at problems. We're very happy to look at the great advantages of what we produce, but we don't like to research the problems, and this is a huge problem. But still, they could not really have predicted the hormonal consequences that spraying these things in the environment and having them in your drinking water and having them in your soils would have on humans, but also on all kinds of other things.
Yeah. Okay, and the last piece of this, I just want you to tell the listeners, if your school or your city is really, really focused on climate change, how can they pitch this idea of, ridding their community or their campus of herbicides as a climate issue?
Of course. How could you not make it into a climate issue? It's central to climate change and central to the large environmental problems that we're seeing. Of course, it's easier for an administrator to understand, okay, I'm receiving this much coal and I'm burning it. That is a problem. But you are dealing with people who are supposed to understand that things come from somewhere. And where pesticides come from is the very same materials and the very same industries that produce the things that we are trying to divest from, trying to get off of. So pesticides are a central piece of the petrolization, some people say carbonization, of the environment. And you might decide to just remove your use of gasoline or petroleum or coal, but if you don't remove also your reliance on chemicals, these chemicals that are applied in vast amounts in the environment, you really are kidding yourself. You're fooling yourself into thinking that you are decarbonizing or depetrolizing your environmental footprint.
Yeah, and we talked about this maybe a little bit in our last conversation about how, yes, a campus is just, X amount of acres. It's not the whole world, but if you can make a campus herbicide-free or, also show that you're saving water, bringing more native plants, it could have this ripple effect.
Absolutely.
How do you think of campuses as sort of being this model that the rest of, communities can follow?
Campuses, universities, but also high schools and so on. First of all, they are, if you will, the seed of the social tree. And so affecting that seed and changing that seed will change the whole society, the whole economy.
Everyone looks at campuses. It's like,
everybody looks at campuses. On a very practical basis, campuses are always experimental grounds. In a very large scale, people use campuses to experiment with social ideas, but also with environmental ideas and environmental applications. What you, Mackenzie, did at Berkeley and what herbicide-free Berkeley used to be, what you did was incredibly important because people look up to that campus as well as to other campuses to see what is modern thinking, to see what is right, to see what should be the next chapter in history. And they really pay attention to try and copy that, to model themselves after that. So producing a model in a campus that you think, okay, well, it's tiny and has very few people and it's all people of the same class and so on and so forth, has incredible consequences because it is held as this model, as this standard for what is modern thinking. And it is true. Because in this case, moving campuses away from pesticides really should be the foreboding of what the world has to become. And so big agricultural fields will become pesticide-free because campuses are pesticide-free, not the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when we did that at Berkeley, we had to make our own celebrations. There was never any announcement that they made or anything.
Of course not.
So you have to be the one to write articles about it and put it all over social media and things because, you have to create your own victories.
Absolutely. They will never accept your victory. They will never give you a star or a medal for it. You have to reach out to people. So building up this network of trust and network of validation among you is something that is essential to maintaining your optimism, maintaining your view of what's right. Because the administration will never admit that you were right. I mean, in your case, there was actually quite some successes actually that you were somewhat recognized, but not at the level that it should be.
Yeah. It did. After a bit, they did, but not even banning glyphosate across the UC system. They never even would publicly announce that they did that. Yeah. Okay. So we talked about the petroleum-based, and just lastly, what about the soil, and how does that, relate to all of this? Soil, water, any of that.
Yeah. It
Biodiversity.
makes me sad to even start thinking about soils under pesticides, because when pesticides affect humans, we react immediately and we say, whoa, that person is growing a cancer, that person is, having serious problems. When it affects plants, we still see them. But for example, in the Berkeley campus, you were part of mourning these majestic, beautiful 100-year-old trees that were killed by herbicide, but they were killed more slowly. So nobody, even though we were trying to raise alarm about it, they said, no, I don't see it dying. Well, you don't see it dying because you're not paying attention over 10 years or 15 years. That's how long it takes to kill the plant. But still we notice. Even more hidden is the damage done to soils. Because nobody really knows much about soils. Nobody cares, because out of sight, out of mind.